Good morning or afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. I am Dylan Williams. I'm Vice President for Government Affairs at the Center for International Policy. Um, uh, I am very pleased to welcome you to this webinar conducted by CIP in coordination with the Win Without War Education Fund. Last week, when I reached out to some of the speakers that you'll hear from on this webinar, it was initially to get their thoughts on what the implications of this forming three-page agreement that Donald Trump claimed he had fully agreed with Iran, uh, what those points were. And then within a matter of hours, it shifted to what the failure to reach an agreement and a looming expiration of the ceasefire meant. And now, where we are, and I'll let our experts get into this in more detail, is where the failure to reach an agreement and an unclear extension of the ceasefire are going to take this conflict and what it means for the various countries and constituencies that it is impacting. I'll introduce our panelists in just a moment, but first, let me just invite you to submit questions using the Q&A function in this webinar on Zoom. We will save time towards the end of the hour for questions submitted via the Q&A function. So I'm very pleased to be joined here today by this distinguished panel. And let me just say at the top here that Center for International Policy's President and CEO Nancy Okail was going to moderate the session, but unfortunately doesn't feel well today. So she asked me to join. And I'm really pleased to be here with some people I've worked with for quite a while on these issues. Andrew Miller is a senior fellow focused on the Middle East in the National Security and International Policy Department at the Center for American Progress. Among a number of senior U.S. government positions he's held, he most recently served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Israeli-Palestinian Affairs in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs at the State Department from 2022 to 2024. Negar Mortazavi, our colleague, is a senior non-resident fellow at the Center for International Policy. She is an award-winning journalist and political commentator and editor and host of the Iran podcast. She's also a former anchor for Voice of America and has been living in forced exile from Iran since 2009. Sam Heller is a Beirut-based researcher, analyst, and fellow at Century International. Sam's work focuses on politics and security in Lebanon, Syria, and their regional neighborhood. He has published extensively with International Crisis Group and the Century Foundation, and for outlets including Foreign Affairs, War on the Rocks, and the Daily Beast. Welcome to all our panelists. And let me start with you, Andrew, to just kind of lay out the landscape of where we are as of this moment. What are the latest, major U.S. and Israeli actions or positions or statements that we should be looking at right now? And what's your best estimation of what the current thinking is? I won't call it strategy, but thinking is within both the United States government and to some extent, to the extent it's clear from the Israeli government as well.
Well, thanks, Dylan. It's great to be on the panel with Sam and Negar, and with you as well, of course. There's been a lot of discussion about U.S.-Israeli positions because the U.S. and Israel jointly launched this operation on February 28th when Israel took the opening strike that assassinated the former Iranian supreme leader, based in part on U.S. intelligence, setting in motion this war, which has had such devastating consequences for civilians and for the global economy, for people everywhere. And while the U.S. and Israel clearly have some overlap in interests, they're by no means identical. Israel has clear interests in mind. They're not necessarily achievable, but you understand what the Israelis are trying to accomplish. And it's essentially what Netanyahu has laid out over the past 30 years. This isn't specific to Netanyahu within the Israeli security elite or even within Israel generally, but he is the one who popularized Iran as the existential threat to Israel as opposed to the Palestinians, which I would argue is the real existential threat for both Israelis and Palestinians, how they are able to work with each other. And for the Netanyahu government, they see this as and continue to see this as a rare moment of opportunity where there's this window they can deliver the knockout punch to the Iranian regime and also to Hezbollah in Lebanon. And for the Israelis, the threat from Iran was never reducible to a specific weapon system or activity. It was the regime itself. There, for all of Netanyahu's protestations that he's not opposed to a deal, he's just opposed to a bad deal, there is no possible deal on the nuclear program that would have satisfied him. The only thing that would have satisfied him is a change in leadership. And in particular, what Israel wants is a weakened Iran. They're not satisfied with any change in leadership. It would have to be one in which Iran is sustainably weakened and is not in a position to project power throughout the region and challenge Israel, pose a threat to Israel. And from the Israeli perspective, and certainly from Netanyahu's perspective, whether that takes the form of a cohesive government that simply is not as strong, or it takes the form of what may look like a failed state is irrelevant because for Israel, which is several thousand miles away, they're less concerned about dealing with the fallout from disorder and chaos that would be taking place within Iran. That's an important distinction between Israel and the Gulf Arab countries who may share some of Netanyahu's views on the Iranian regime, but don't want to be dealing with the failed state across the Persian Gulf. Netanyahu also has a strong political motivation because he is trailing in the polls. He has been. Nothing he seems to do changes that reality, and he likely views a decisive defeat over Iran as the Hail Mary, the last opportunity he has to potentially change those dynamics and not only sustain his rule and power, but potentially avoid jail time, which is the worst possible outcome for him. And then in Lebanon, they see Hezbollah being weakened and believe this is the moment that you press your advantage and you try to disarm them. And if the Lebanese government and armed forces won't do it themselves, then Israel's going to do it. Again, these aren't necessarily achievable objectives, but they're at least logical, they're coherent. With the United States, by contrast, the US, for one, really isn't invested in Lebanon. The US has largely been deferential to Israeli policy, but we saw when it came to the ceasefire, Trump was not prepared to allow Israeli actions in Lebanon to potentially jeopardize the ceasefire. So there was a limit to which he was prepared to give Netanyahu a carte blanche. That doesn't mean that will continue. I think if this war does end, and hopefully it will at some point, eventually Trump is going to allow Netanyahu to resume his operations in Lebanon against Hezbollah. But for the time being, there is a degree of difference. And then with Iran, I mean, it's entirely incoherent. As you said, there is no strategy. There really is no interest. As far as I can tell, what Trump cares about is the nuclear program, and in particular, doing better than Obama did on the nuclear program, because this all comes down to his psychological standing and his ability to show that he's better than Obama because he's so insecure about it. And then, on a similar vein, everything else is filtered through the prism of how he's perceived. The standoff in the Strait of Hormuz, issues regarding ballistic missiles, the status of the regime. As long as he can spin it as being favorable to his image, he can tolerate it. But it's more difficult for him to do that with certain issues than with others. So that's particularly important to keep in mind. And what's troubling beyond just this strategic incoherence is that Trump's view about how far to press this is very malleable. There were times where he seemed to be pulling back because he recognized the damage that this was doing, in particular economically, on the markets, on US Treasury bills, on prices. But all it took was, fortunately, the rescue of the American pilots. And from that rescue, he somehow extrapolated that the United States was in a stronger military position than he thought, and we should press the advantage. That's just it's irrational. That I mean, it was wonderful that it was done, and it was an impressive display by the U.S. military, but it has no bearing on whether the U.S. can ultimately succeed, in this war. So there's a high degree of concern in that regard. But the second key point is, although there you don't have identical interests between US and Israel, there's a high degree of interdependency. And for Israel, it's obvious because in Iran in particular, Israel has no chance of achieving its objectives without US support. And in particular, Israel needs U.S. defensive support, missile defense. While the Israelis continue to deny it, I think it's beyond question that Israel is running low on interceptors for at least several of their major premier missile defense systems, and the presence of U.S. destroyers, of other U.S. Missile defense batteries reduces some of the burden on Israel. And without that support, it would have been much more difficult for Israel to launch this attack. But also, despite Israeli military competence, and in particular the impressive performance of its air force, they only have two or three refuelers, tankers. And that limits the number of planes that you can put on target at any point in time. And for the US to be there, at the very least, providing that logistical support is absolutely critical to sustaining a kinetic campaign that would have any chance of making a real impact in Iran, let alone toppling the regime. And of course, to have a better chance of achieving a political change in regime, the active participation of the U.S. military would have a major impact on the probability of that, but it still would come up short for reasons that we can others may want to discuss, or we can discuss at greater length. And for the United States, there's interdependence as well in that we've seen that for the Trump administration, Israel is a very, very convenient is a very, very convenient out for their actions. It's easy to blame Israel when things go wrong and say, well, they made us do it, which is just, it's disingenuous to say the least. It's not that the Israelis haven't been advocating for this for 30 years. They have been. It's just that every other president, including Trump in his first term, had the wisdom to say no. But the notion that the United States couldn't have said no to Israel, and Israel would have been free to conduct this campaign in the way that it did, even without U.S. support, is preposterous. But we've seen, Trump to a certain level, but Rubio and others freely trot this out as it wasn't our decision. The Israelis were going to do it. We're just making the best of it. Um, so just a closing point in terms of what this actually means for where things are going. You know, since neither the Israel nor the U.S. is going to achieve their objectives, it becomes, the key question becomes when and under what conditions are they prepared to cut bait? And I think for Israel, there aren't conditions, right? It's going to be the United States having to cut the bait for them, and having to swallow that. But for the United States, it's surprising that it hasn't happened as of yet, given just how disastrous the war has been in terms of its impact, not in terms of the tactical prosecution of the war. That has been as one would expect, but in terms of the strategic objectives, you could see, for instance, a circumstance in which Trump might be able to get a nuclear agreement that he could argue would be slightly better than the JCPOA. That's not a guarantee, but it's not beyond the realm of the possible if there is, a year or two of a moratorium on enrichment, plus the restrictions on the level of uranium that can be enriched. You could argue, and not completely baselessly, that that would be, substantively better than the JCPOA. That's possible. And I think you can see that the removal of the U.S. blockade of Iranian ships could lead to the movement of traffic through the Strait of Hormuz again. Whether the circumstances are such that the Iranians are forcing everyone to go through their channel on Larik Island and there are tolls. Trump doesn't seem particularly concerned with that. So the conditions seem to potentially be there, which raises questions again about why they haven't moved more expeditiously towards that outcome, where he has in other situations where he's been able to pull a 180 and try to minimize the losses. For the Israelis, this is much, much more dangerous. If the conflict were to end tomorrow, we would have an Iran that clearly has been badly damaged, but is in a strategically superior position, I would argue, and defer to Negar and others on this, but than they were after the Iraq War. In that, after the Iraq War, they clearly were in a very strong position and were able to influence developments across the region, but they didn't necessarily have this. They didn't have this control over a strategic asset in the global economy that would not only concern and affect regional countries, but would affect countries across the globe, including great power competition. And to see Iran emerge from where it was, or where it was perceived to be, to that stage, and where Arab countries would be looking at Iran and wondering, who's going to protect us under these circumstances? United States and Israel, yes, they have military ability, but they don't listen to what we're saying. They don't listen to our concerns. That's not necessarily a favorable strategic outlook for Israel. So this could come out looking very, very bad for the Israelis, which is not surprising for Netanyahu's track record, but you could see that diversion taking place where it's not good for the United States, it's not good for Trump, but the losses can be absorbed just because of the superior position of the U.S. internationally. But for Israel, this could be very, very troubling and could lead to ultimately a much weakened position that accelerates some of the trends that we've seen as a result of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where Israelis increasingly feel uncomfortable remaining in Israel, remaining in the Middle East under these circumstances. So with that, I'll turn it over.
Thanks so much, Andrew. And we're already getting follow-up questions, which we'll circle back to on some of what you covered. Um, Next, I'd like to turn to my colleague, Negar Mortazavi. Negar, what, as far as we can tell, are at this point the Iranian regime's objectives, estimation of their current thinking, and then perhaps separately, what are attitudes among Iran's civilian population and how do those break down?
Sure. Thank you so much. Thanks, Dylan, and everyone at CIP for having this very timely conversation. And it's great to see you, Andrew and Sam, both. So I'll start a little bit by just sort of piggybacking on what Andrew was saying, which is the view from Iran and maybe even the global community on, I mean, initially, I would like to throw in the three W's into this sort of whole paradigm of the war: the why, what, and when. Why did this war start? I mean, this is a question that I guess everyone in the US is asking, in Iran, both the government and the society, and then also potentially the global community. What was the reason? Was it the nuclear program? Was it Iran's, presence in the region. Now it seems to be reopening the Strait of Hormuz, which wasn't even a problem before this war started. And so the goalpost has moved, at least for the US throughout this war, not so much for Israel. And I completely agree with Andrew. I don't have too much to add as far as his description of the Israeli side, but I think for the US, it's just very unclear. Second question is what? What is this? Is this a limited military operation? Is this another endless war in the Middle East? Is this a war that was started just for the case of winning? Was it supposed to be a somewhat Venezuela model, as some had described it? Is it going to be boots on the ground, eventually ground incursion? Is it to extract the uranium that's buried deep in the heart of Iran? Is it to occupy Khark Island? Is it to destroy the Iranian civilization? I mean, you name it, depending on the day or even the time of the day. If we go by the Truth Social of the commander in chief, the what can be very confusing. And also, as far as who you listen to within the administration, which secretary and which spokesperson. And then finally, when? When is this going to end? Is it going to be limited? Is it a few days? Is it a few weeks? Is it a few more months? Or is it just going to be another endless war in the Middle East, which right now it looks like there seems to be no end in sight. And then I also think the irony I just wanted to add is that this war was something that now we keep hearing from former administration officials. It was something that was put on the table of almost every US president, as Andrew said. It's been a project by Benjamin Netanyahu in the past 2, 3 decades. Nobody did it except for the quote unquote president of peace. I mean, if you listen to Donald Trump's comments, his criticism, even attacks on past presidents for endless wars that were launched in the Middle East that are now failures, and potentially a war in Iran that never happened. I mean, I think, attacked President Obama at least a dozen times for potentially thinking of a military action against Iran. And his critique is very much on point. So if you just remove the name of the person and put that out now, it makes a lot of sense. But the irony is that the president of peace, who thinks he deserves the Nobel Peace Prize for ending wars around the world, eventually started this very big war, endless and useless, I would say, in the Middle East. And then finally, just to, or no, finally, but like to the big question, Dylan, that you put out there. I mean, inside Iran also, all of these questions really remain. I mean, there's the thinking of course, the government. And now when you talk about the Iranian government, I mean, whatever is remain of the Iranian government, which brings us to one of the initial goals, at least that was pushed mostly by the Israelis, but then potentially some in the US, regime change. I mean, we see that the regime, I mean, the leadership and the top brass have been assassinated. There potentially it can be more, but the regime in itself didn't really change. I would argue it even got more hardline, if not more, there's more cohesion. They were able to basically put the house back together. There was a council of leadership immediately after the supreme leader was assassinated. And then a supreme leader was selected, which again, the irony was that we know from past reporting and conversations that the previous supreme leader, the father of the current supreme leader, wasn't really in favor of his son becoming, his successor, because potentially this could give out, a portrayal of monarchy, the power being transferred from father to son. And then eventually it happened because of the circumstances, the assassination, and this kind of pressure, the wartime sort of situation. And this is the supreme leader is someone who is close to the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards, and sort of that military and intelligence apparatus inside the country. So there were discussions and debates for succession if it had happened naturally without this sort of emergency war situation, and potentially more moderate candidates were being discussed or highlighted, and even potentially a council of leaders, different new chapters for the Islamic Republic. But we see that basically what happened is, as far as regime change, Ayatollah Khamenei was replaced by a younger Ayatollah Khamenei. And then as far as Iran's response, just to give you a sort of bird's eye view, the policy or the defense doctrine, I would say, because Iranians see this as a defense, right? This war came to them as an aggression. They didn't really choose it. And they're fighting. We have to remember they're fighting to defend. For them, this is not about winning. This is about not losing. This is about protecting the homeland, sovereignty. They're fighting on their turf, their independence, etc. And the thinking is that with Donald Trump, this is the third time that the Iranians see war coming. Initially was the assassination of the top general Soleimani. That was seen as a declaration of war by Iran. Second time was last year, the 12-day war in June. And this is the third time. And their thinking was that the first two times, or throughout the first term and the second term of Donald Trump, they have shown too much restraint. They offered off ramps and exits. They didn't escalate in the face of these attacks. And in the case of last year's war, particularly, the debate inside Iran is that they accepted the ceasefire too early and without showing enough deterrence. And that's why the war keeps coming back to them. Essentially, they see Donald Trump as, and they say this very much on the record, as quote unquote a bully that keeps coming back because Iran has projected weakness in the face of these attacks. The restraint that they think they have shown is seen as weakness. And so the policy has changed. And now with the previous supreme leader gone, this very much is a new chapter in Iran's doctrine. And they had telegraphed this before very much privately and publicly, and also to their neighbors, particularly the GCC, which I'm going to talk about a little later. But their message was that this time there will be no restraint. If we get attacked, and they see this as an existential war, as a battle of survival, essentially, they were coming for the entirety of the Islamic Republic. The messaging was that we will escalate potentially even more, and we will make sure this war doesn't stay within Iran's borders, and they will make sure that they will spread it, that everyone potentially in the region and in the world will feel the pain, and this war will not just be contained to killing and destruction inside Iran. And we see that they actually did it. They made good on all of their promises. They made it regional, they made it global. And the Strait of Hormuz was something that the Iranians had been discussing throughout years, potentially as a theory. And then finally, they made it happen. And they have a chokehold on about 20% of global energy. The global community is feeling the pain of this war. They don't understand why. They want no part in it. They want it to end, but they're feeling the pain, and this is particularly part of the Iranian strategy. And then, of course, within the region, I mean, the GCC countries, and each country is different as far as their position and how they were before and also throughout the war. I mean, there's Oman, who's tried to keep itself completely outside. There's Qatar somewhere in the middle, and then there's the rest of the GCC. But the Iranian thinking towards the GCC is that the U.S. bases, as Andrew also mentioned, the U.S. bases in this region, just across the water, the Persian Gulf from Iran, have provided part of an infrastructure of attack of this war that was launched against Iran. And the irony is that these bases were in these countries in the name of defense, in the name of protection for these countries all these years. And eventually they turned into, and both this is true for the last year war, for the June war, the 12-day war, and then also for this year. They became part of an infrastructure of attack. I mean, the Iranians don't believe that these bases are not being utilized, are not being used, no matter what the messaging is from the GCC. And they see all of this sort of connected all the way through to Tampa CENTCOM. And part of, and also again, bigger picture, if we take a step back, the thinking is if these bases were not there, this war probably wouldn't even happen. Like, this provided the presence, the US presence, and sort of at least the confidence of that infrastructure provide one key sort of support or factor for the war to be able to launch once last year and then again this year, and then also with the assassination of Soleimani, which again I think is important for Iran. That was the first time of a declaration of war by the Trump administration. And so I think putting all of these sort of puzzles together, and then moving also to the Iranian people. Dylan, you asked about the society. That's a great question. I'm glad you asked. First of all, there isn't one Iranian view. Anybody who claims to have one Iranian view, doesn't have it. And I'm not going to do that. There's multiple pockets of the society. But if we want to simplify them into maybe two or three big groups, I would say there's, of course, one group which we're seeing a lot more inside Iran these days, which is sort of the base of the Islamic Republic, the base of the government. They support it no matter what, all the policies. And they're the ones who have been, on the front line. They've been demonstrating on the street, outpouring of grief after assassination, now rallies for support. They fill bridges when Donald Trump threatens to bomb Iranian bridges. They circle infrastructure, civilian infrastructure to protect it. And that base has grown in size and in power. There's also, I would say, the opposite side of the society, which was much, much smaller and I would say is even shrinking, that was so opposed to the government, radical, that they would even welcome this kind of external attack or force or war or regime change, thinking, I'm at my wit's end. I can't tolerate the status quo anymore. Just end this misery in whatever way you can. And it's interesting, some of the arguments, especially for people on the ground, you hear this more in the diaspora, which I think is a little more unrealistic. But for people who are inside the country, when you would ask them, but these are going to be your homes to be bombed, these are going to be your kids' schools, and don't you see Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria, these failed examples? There was sort of a thinking that no, maybe there is a surgical way of doing it. Maybe there's a targeted way. They're not going to harm the population. They're not going to harm civilians. They're going to support the Iranian people. Help is going to come, literally, quote unquote, for the Iranian people. And then I think throughout the course of the war, every week, as people saw more civilians killed, more infrastructure being attacked, and also publicly on the record, the president saying he's going to go after cultural sites, bridges, ending the civilization. I think that part of the population that was, I would say, pro-war inside the country has become smaller and shrinking and now coming to realization that there is no war just on the Islamic Republic. And this is very much proving to be a war on Iran and on Iranians. I mean, from the viewpoint of a lot of people like myself, when you go after cultural sites that are centuries old, this is the heritage of a people, of a civilization. This has nothing to do with the government. And so I would say, and then finally, there's another pocket of population, which I would say is the largest actually in the middle, the gray area that's not very much ultra supportive of the government and is not that radical opposition. It has a lot of grievances, political, economic, social. They take to the street in many demonstrations again and again and again. But at the same time, they don't think that this external war is a solution for making things better. They look at their neighbors to the east, Afghanistan, to the west, Iraq, Syria, you name it. All of these, military incursions or wars in the region didn't really make things better for any of those countries or their neighbors. And so I think there's sort of that realization that, okay, whatever problems we have, and there's many and very deep, it's not going to be resolved or get any better with this destruction that's coming from the air, the quote unquote freedom bombs. And so, I want to end it and then answer any questions, but just I think this is a realization that is being made inside Iran, both by the state and also the society, and also very much within the neighborhood. I was just in Doha for a month. And I got a chance to speak to a lot of people from the region, across the Arab world, and it just seems to be more and more this realization that the war started with no reason, with a lot of pressure from Israel, that US interests are not served, that Iran and Iranians are really being targeted, and that the sooner this war ends, I would say, the better for, of course, civilians across the region who are paying the main price. And then one final layer I want to add to all of this, I don't know if we'll have time to talk about this, and Dylan, maybe you can chip in, is international law. I mean, the first casualty of these wars are civilians, of course. And then the second is international law. I mean, international law, you talk about international law in this region, it's dead. There is no such thing as international law, especially after 3 years of the war in Gaza, genocide, etc. Because I see sometimes these legal discourse about the Strait of Hormuz, freedom of navigation, this and that, from the viewpoint of at least the Iranians, who are now the main target and victim of this war, there is no international law. I mean, this war started without a vote from the U.S. Congress, from the Security Council, U.S. closest allies, and also the global community. So I would say that's one thing that I keep hearing from people across the region and beyond, that the war has to end.
Thank you so much for those perspectives, Negar, and for the note about international law. Very important. Sam, I don't know whether one wants to call it an additional front to this war, a separate war in itself, the continuation of a long-standing Israeli project, but the impacts in Lebanon. that have occurred during the course of the U.S. and Israeli war in Iran, and of course, the Israeli assault in Lebanon itself. How are the Lebanese government, different components of the Lebanese polity, viewing the situation and their options?
Hi, thanks. I mean, first, yeah, I mean, great to join. Um, no, I mean, this point about how kind of the war in Lebanon relates to this, I mean, the war on Iran, this broader conflict, I mean, it is something that is hotly contested uh, in Lebanon, right? I mean, this is a subject of really intense political polarization debate. Um, just to kind of provide some kind of some background here. So here in Beirut, we are on day 7 of a 10-day ceasefire that expires on Sunday. It's not clear what happens after that. The ceasefire was announced after 46 days of war. I mean, that was initiated first by like a Hezbollah rocket barrage on Israel, and then Israel kind of launched a like massive retaliation. Um, Per the last official numbers, we still have more than 1 million people here displaced, more than 100,000 in official shelters, like roughly 2,300 people here killed, more than 7,000 injured. Um, since the announcement of the ceasefire, some people have attempted to return. The kind of return trajectories have varied depending on where people are from. Many people went back to visit their areas only to kind of return to their areas of displacement after finding that their homes were destroyed or that they fall within Israel's kind of newly delineated security zone in the south and that they are unable to return. Certainly, I think the government, Hezbollah, Amal, kind of Hezbollah's like partner Shiite political party, have all discouraged people from attempting to return on a lasting basis. And then violence continues. Yesterday, Israel just killed a prominent Lebanese journalist who was yeah, I mean, who was in like in an area on the kind of periphery of its security zone. Yeah, so the zone that the Israelis have imposed in the south, it's demarcated by what the Israelis have variously called a forward security line or a Gaza-style yellow line. It's roughly 5 to 10 kilometers in from the two countries' border. The objective seems to be to prevent any Hezbollah incursions or direct fire on communities in Israel's north. Um, they seem to be keeping intent on kind of keeping this area depopulated, except for a handful of Christian villages that are kind of marooned or behind Israeli lines. Um, yeah, and then they have. It seems that they're treating this area as a kill zone effectively. Um, Even during the ceasefire, then they continue to carry out demolitions in the areas that they presently control and to strike purported Hezbollah targets both inside and outside the zone. Hezbollah has also claimed several reprisal attacks, which seem like they are kind of quantitatively, they are sort of ramping up over the past few days. So after I think maybe one claim the day previous, I think yesterday there were 4 announced. There is a second round of U.S.-led direct Lebanese-Israeli talks scheduled to be held in Washington today. Um, including the Lebanese and Israeli ambassadors to the U.S., and then like a very high-level U.S. delegation. The first round of these talks was held last Wednesday, April 15th, and then the United States announced this ceasefire the day after. Um, so the kind of provenance, the ownership of this ceasefire, again, is disputed. Um, so Iran had kind of pretty clearly publicly insisted on Lebanon's inclusion in any regional ceasefire. And Hezbollah now continues to say that, I mean, that basically this ceasefire came about because of Iran's pressure. Whereas Lebanon's president and prime minister frame it and instead as the like the work of kind of official Lebanese diplomacy. Uh, After the announcement of the ceasefire, they each kind of thanked a long list of countries that pointedly excluded Iran. Um, they and the kind of Lebanese foreign ministry had previously rejected Iran's inclusion of Lebanon in any ceasefire negotiations, insisted that that no one else could negotiate in Lebanon's name other than Lebanon itself. So for them, it seems that it's a matter of kind of asserting um, Lebanese state sovereignty, particularly after kind of Hezbollah entered the war unilaterally with its initial strike on Israel. Um, so yeah, I mean, this latter war, though. I mean, so it takes place in a context. It follows a November 2024 ceasefire that was after the kind of previous Israeli escalation in the country, um, which had in practice uh, entailed kind of Israel's continued occupation of sections of southern Lebanon in violation of the agreement, Israel's daily bombing across Lebanon against what it claimed were breaches of the agreement, and the creation of a mechanism, a sort of committee involving the U.S., France, Israel, um, Lebanon, and UNIFIL that was ostensibly to adjudicate kind of violations of the agreement, was in practice it seemed used by the U.S. and Israel to task the Lebanese army to dismantle Hezbollah military infrastructure, even as Israel continued to directly intervene militarily in Lebanon and to attack again on basically a daily basis. Um, Hezbollah, for its part, did not retaliate over the ensuing 15 months. Um, I think, in retrospect, I mean, it said that it was providing an opportunity for the government to try to, to realize a halt to Israeli attacks and Israel's withdrawal from occupied Lebanese territory through diplomatic means. Um, in retrospect, yeah, I mean, it looks like they were, that they made a choice. They were preparing for, I think, what they assumed was an inevitable future round of conflict. Um, yeah, I mean, the Lebanese government had been attempting to achieve some of those goals diplomatically, and then for 15 months, basically got like no results. Kind of during the previous ceasefire, during this kind of last round of conflict, and then now, since the announcement of this latest ceasefire, I mean, the Lebanese government has taken a number of steps to, in an attempt to appease the United States and the international community, and thus maybe kind of apply indirect pressure on Israel. and to demonstrate itself as a willing partner in disarming Hezbollah and imposing kind of sovereign state control across Lebanese territory. But I think that most of these steps, were judged to be not credible, and then they entailed very limited practical follow through. Latterly, the government had made repeated appeals for, you know, or proposed direct negotiations with Israel. Um, and it was last week that the Israelis finally accepted that, apparently at U.S. urging. But so far, the kind of the terms of this ceasefire that were announced, ostensibly with both kind of approved by both the Lebanese and Israeli sides after last week's direct talks. These terms were even worse and more lopsided than November 2024. The ceasefire was framed as a goodwill gesture by the Israelis. Its extension is subject to the Lebanese government's ability or the Lebanese government demonstrating its ability to assert its sovereignty. The document, it refers only to Israel's right to self-defense. There is no parallel language for Lebanon. It provides basically an unlimited license for Israeli defensive action, including preemptively. And then there is no reference to Israel's withdrawal from its now kind of expanded occupation zone in the south. So the text of this, I think, is pretty clearly embarrassing. It is, as far as I know, it is not clear who on the Lebanese side actually reviewed and endorsed these terms. But yeah, I mean, the text of this was definitely consistent with the impression I got when I was in Washington earlier this month, where I left kind of very pessimistic about U.S. intentions in Lebanon, and then with the sense that, that to the extent that they were motivated to secure a ceasefire either now or later, then it would be on terms like this. My sense is that the U.S., or at least kind of some of Trump's staff, if not Trump himself, that they are interested in trying to sort of to broker like an Israeli-Lebanese condominium with Israel as the very clear senior party that legitimates continued direct Israeli military intervention against Hezbollah and Lebanese Shia. The government here is sort of like weirdly disconnected from the reality of the war. They regularly insist that this was not our war, that this was imposed on the country. They talk mainly about the kind of imposition of state sovereignty internally, even as the country is very obviously under kind of continued external attack. And then they're using kind of that rhetorical frame as to audition for more external support, including kind of donor country support for the Lebanese army. But yeah, I mean, it seems clear that that the government has no real formula for like ensuring Lebanon's sovereignty or for protecting Lebanon's Shiite Muslim community in particular, which I think now faces a kind of specific existential threat from Israel. The government continues to stress that it is the Lebanese army and official security services that are the answer here. But then I think it is lost on no one that at the outset of this war, then the Lebanese army received orders to withdraw from the south and then not to contest Israel's invasion. And then I think they subsequently exited even the few kind of Christian areas where they had retained some limited presence. For Hezbollah, I think that they say that there is no going back to before March 2nd, and then that 15 months kind of false ceasefire experience. They're retaliating apparently to exact a cost for Israeli actions, maybe to prevent the Israelis from establishing a stable occupying presence in the country's south. But it's not clear what their sort of more like strategic end game is, or if they are kind of counting on Lebanon's inclusion in some kind of larger regional dispensation. Public opinion here is very intensely divided. And it always is and has been, but certainly kind of even more so now. I mean, along the lines of what Negar was saying about the Iranian public. Yeah, I mean, beware anyone who is claiming to be a sort of tribune, like an authentic representative of the Lebanese people, especially because I think that there is one Lebanese contingent that is very represented in Washington and in Washington policy circles that people who talk about kind of broad public rejection of Hezbollah, about an Iranian occupation of the country, who, I mean, I think clearly, I think they represent some Lebanese, but then, they are not, yeah, they are not, they represent a specific Lebanese faction. Yeah, I mean, at this point, it just seems like kind of the war continues. And so the only question going forward is kind of at what sort of pace or level of escalation it will proceed. Presumably, as a reflection of kind of broader regional dynamics.
Thanks for that. And on that point, let me just, follow up with a few quick questions here. We only have a couple minutes left, but one question we've gotten from the audience is, what is the ability of the United States to sustain a blockade and some of the negative consequences of that? And Andrew, I think that's to you. And let me just broaden that out a bit. In addition to answering that precisely, what can we expect if there's not a formal settlement, but sort of an open-ended ceasefire, or simply a decision by Trump not to escalate further, and we kind of muddle through here?
Thanks, Dylan. In terms of the blockade, the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Air Force can maintain a blockade indefinitely. The question is the opportunity cost. What would we otherwise be doing with those planes, with those ships, with the satellites and intel collection platforms, if we weren't trying to enforce a blockade? And that's where the costs begin to add up. And I would argue that this entire project, this entire Operation Epic Fury, this campaign has substantially reduced the U.S. military projection power in East Asia, to the point where we're directly pulling from East Asia to send to the Middle East. And that's not only inconsistent with the preferences of the last several administrations, it's inconsistent with what was stated in President Trump's own national security strategy that was released at the end of last year, that we wanted to build up, we wanted to ensure that we maintained or that we achieved a preponderance of power in the South China Sea, in the island chains. Well, one of the aircraft carriers, the Lincoln, which is sitting in the Gulf of Oman, that came from the South China Sea. Several of the THAAD batteries, the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, that's the U.S.'s most elite, most sophisticated strategic missile defense system, have been pulled from East Asia. In fact, because several THAAD batteries have been hit by the Iranians, we've had to pull some from South Korea. And with South Korea looking across the border at North Korea with nuclear weapons and ICBMs, that's not a comfortable position. I think it would be an understatement to say they're peeved that the United States is pulling essential missile defense equipment to throw it into what they view as a money pit in the Middle East. And the same is true of the battleships, the cruisers, the other vessels that are enforcing it. So we can do it for as long as you want. It's just that it's going to ultimately leave us more vulnerable in other parts of the world. And that doesn't mean that China is going to immediately exploit that opportunity. They're going to be more patient. But if you leave that gap open, eventually someone's going to step in. And that is the real risk there. In terms of the ceasefire, if the U.S. just walked away and ultimately Iran decided to allow ships to pass in one way or another, and the U.S. was not seeking to enforce some type of blockade, for your average American, it would probably be a manageable situation, but it would be still an inferior position economically and financially than they were before the war started. Because what you'll see is that the risk that at any point in time the strait could close, that Iran could resume its efforts to close the transit point will have to be priced in to the valuation of both domestic and international barrels of oil. And that means not only oil on the open market, but it's going to come home to the price at the pump. Americans are going to be paying more than they would have otherwise. And as many have read in newspapers and have heard discussed, the knock-on effects are tremendous. This is the central input for so much of what we do because it affects transportation. It produces byproducts that are used in so many different sectors. If you wanted to look at, a strategic campaign to destabilize global economies, this is where you would start. The U.S. just is still in a relatively favorable position where we could manage it, but Americans aren't going to be happy that they're paying more. Now, for other countries where they're going to be more directly affected because it's not just the prices that will rise. They could actually see shortages of supplies in Europe, in East Asia. That could potentially be politically and destabilizing. It could potentially lead to security ramifications. And so it's not just an annoyance. It's not just a pocketbook issue. It could become something that's much more dire. And that's why just leaving the situation, this wound open to heal, you could argue is still better than continuing the war, but it's still far inferior to trying to reach an agreed settlement that would address all of these issues. And just finally, from the perspective of the GCC states, and Negar, may have more to, this is a nightmare scenario where they're going to have difficulty persuading international companies to move their headquarters, to move additional staff, to invest more in the UAE, in Qatar, in Saudi Arabia, when the only thing that is preventing the resumption of the war is a notional understanding that it's disadvantageous, as opposed to some type of agreement where there are clear consequences or monitoring mechanisms that will provide advanced warning that an attack or a potential return to violence is coming. So that would foretell a very, very destabilizing period for the global economy.
Thanks, Andrew. In our last few minutes here, let me get thoughts from Negar on either adding to that or what an end game or muddling through means, and then over to Sam after that as well. Negar.
Yeah, just quickly to add to this, because I get this question a lot, why Iran is, having this chokehold on global energy, the Strait of Hormuz, and it's not very clear. Exactly because of what Andrew described, and I just want to add to this. This is, I would say, the luxury of geography for Americans. You can live in a country that's sort of far away, separated by seas from the rest of the world. You can launch wars, death, and destruction halfway across the world and not really have it affect your daily life. And I think this is part of the Iranian strategy and thinking that the only way we can impact, and the war we know is unpopular in the US. Poll after poll has shown that the American people are not behind this war. They know the failed examples of US blood and treasure spent in past Middle East wars, 20 years of war in Afghanistan. The keys had to be handed back to the Taliban, and the country's in much worse shape than it was nation building, democracy, women's rights. None of that happened. Insecurity, instability, all of that. But I think, yeah, and this is part of that strategy that the only way this can really put pressure or transfer that public pressure onto the decision making is through economy, through the price of gas, transportation, and all of that. And again, just back to Andrew's point on the GCC, that's precisely why Iran's neighbors, I mean, these powers across the region were lobbying against this war before it started, telling the president, the US president, to not do it because they exactly saw what was coming. But of course, they didn't have as much power as that one country in the region who eventually got the war.
Thank you, Negar. Sam, over to you for any final perspectives.
Well, just on, I mean, yeah, I mean, what happens if there is, I mean, if things kind of just persist in one form or another, and and then there is no kind of decisive outcome here. Yeah, I mean, I think that it seems that Hezbollah throughout this, I mean, kind of during the war and then now in this kind of brief interregnum, seems like it has been betting on Iran. Iran's so far, credible inclusion or prioritization of Lebanon and Iran's superior leverage, including its control over the Strait of Hormuz to kind of deliver an improved like dispensation outcome for Lebanon. And then, in fact, the criticisms that people have made here of the Lebanese government's decision to enter these kind of bilateral U.S.-sponsored talks with the Israelis. One of the main criticisms is that they've gone into this with no leverage, right? And that kind of just Lebanon on its own, kind of delinked as the government here has tried to do from Iran, has very little to bargain with. But yeah, I mean, I guess the maybe the like a counterpoint to that is that it's not clear. I mean, obviously Iran has real leverage. I mean, I guess it seems maybe not clear that they can actually convert that into like a desirable negotiated outcome, if only because of the dysfunction of the U.S. side of that negotiation, right? I mean, it's not clear to me that these Americans are actually capable of successfully negotiating in any sort of detail, and then so I don't know. I don't know kind of how Iran then maybe takes advantage of its notional leverage.
And I'll just note that adding to all this uncertainty, someone in the questions has commented on the firings at a very high level of the U.S. military in the U.S. military by the Trump administration, and I think that just summarizes the complete uncertainty and lack of strategy that we are all faced with here. We've gone over, so I want to thank our experts for their time and insights today. I want to thank the audience for joining. I want to thank our partners at Win Without War Education Fund. Hope everybody stays safe and takes care. Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.